I've been using the iPhone 12 for about a month now, so I thought I'd just share my opinion on its slow motion capabilities. And when I say slow motion, I include the 4K 60 as well. So generally, I'm just going to be speaking about what you can expect or what my opinion is on the 4K 60 and the Full HD 120 and 240. I just thought it might be useful because I was curious as well before buying the phone about what kind of quality you can expect from different modes. And let's face it, we all love filming slow motion now and again, or maybe even too often, to be honest. Anyways, the clips you see playing right now are from my latest trip or my recent trip to the beach, and they're all in 120 frames per second unless otherwise stated. So a few of them are going to be 240 frames per second, and I'll put something up on the screen so you know which one of those are. One of the first things I found out about the iPhone, which was a pleasant surprise, is that the 4K 60 seems to offer the exact same quality as the 4K 24, as far as I can tell, both in terms of compression, motion artifacts, and how heavily you can grade each of them, which is amazing because in my previous cameras I've used, for example the Sony Alpha 7S Mark II, if you're going to film in 1080 60 frames per second, the image is going to be clearly worse than if you film in 1080 24 frames per second. So basically you end up having to make a choice. If you want the best quality, you have to film in 24 frames per second, but then if you decide you want to slow it down afterwards in post while editing, you can't. You're just stuck at regular speed. And if you want the flexibility of being able to slow it down later, you have to film at 60, but then you get an image that's clearly not as good. You can see much more artifact and compression in the image. With the iPhone, I've tested it with lots and lots of difficult shots and conditions. Shots with lots of leaves and movement in the background and lots of details throughout the entire shot. And what I found was the 60 frames per second held up just as well as the 24 frames per second. If you want some samples, you can check out my previous iPhone video. It was filmed entirely at 4K 60 frames per second, and the shot actually held up surprisingly well for the amount of detail within the scene. And even if I switched it to 24 frames per second, the quality I would get would be exactly the same. It would not be any better. Now I think part of the reason for that might be because having looked on the Apple spec sheet, I think the bit rate for the 60 frames per second is about double that of the 24 frames per second. So even though you have more frames per second to record, you have more bit rate to spread between each of the frames. So in the end you end up with about the same quality. This is really great because now it means I can just film everything at 4K 60 and always having that option to slow it down later in post without having to worry about any loss of quality. Of course, there are a few exceptions where you might want to use 24 frames per second. For example, if you want those cinema look with the motion blur, you might want to use 24 frames per second, but you also have to use some ND filters, because if you film in broad daylight, even if you film at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is going to be so high that your motion is going to be pretty jittery anyway. So obviously if you want that kind of smoother cinema look, then you have to film at 24 frames per second and also use an ND, which is basically like sunglasses for your camera, to lower down the shutter speed so it's slightly slow and you get more motion blur, so it looks a bit more like smoother, like cinema-like. Now another case where you might want to use 24 frames per second obviously is in low light, because if you film at 60 frames per second, then your shutter speed will have to be higher than that, probably at least double. So you'll be, in low light you get lots of noise, but if you film at 24, then you can halve your shutter speed pretty much basically, and you get, one stop more or one stop less ISO. You get like a cleaner image. Another thing that really surprised me in a good way is how well these images stand up to being color graded. Obviously the quality of the image for the 4K 60 is going to be the best, and then the Full HD 120 you start to see more motion artifacts and compression, and the image is not going to be as sharp. And when you get to 240, let's be honest, the image is pretty bad. But despite all that, if you try to color grade them, they all stand up to color grading pretty equal to each other. That means you can grade the 120 as heavily as the 4K 60 without the image breaking apart, which is quite surprising. I would expect, the 120, if you grade it just a bit, the image would just break apart, and 240 might be just uncolor gradable. But as it stands, you can color grade, the 120 as heavily and as stylish. You can put as much style into it as the 4K 60. But of course, you still have the initial quality loss that you suffer at the beginning. But it's not going to break apart any faster when you start color grading it, which is great. But having said that, obviously, I think the 4K 60 is just going to be my main mode of shooting, and then the 120 and 240 is going to be used pretty sparingly, especially with the 240, which we'll get into. The 240 is just, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to use it again, to be honest. So I guess we might as well start with the 240 frames per second, which to put simply, it's just pretty bad. There's just heavy compression, there's lots of motion artifacts everywhere. Your whole image kind of look kind of blocky and jagged. You can actually see the jagged edges where there's movement in the image. So it's pretty bad. You're not going to get a beautiful image out of it. You might use it just to capture a moment or an action that you want to have in slow motion, but that's pretty much the extent of it, really. You might be able to get away with it a bit if you're filming a scene that's really not taxing on the bitrate at all. For example, a solid background color like a blue sky or a colored wall or just a black background, and you have like a small subject or maybe like a large subject moving around in that blank background. So obviously all the bitrate will be used on the subject itself, and the solid color background, doesn't have much detail, so it's not going to take up much of the bitrate. Then you might be able to kind of combine it with 4K 60 and Full HD 120, and you can kind of get away with it a little bit. But still, it's not going to be an image that's going to blow you away. I guess if you're watching it on like a mobile phone, then it's going to be okay. But even then, even on a small screen, you can actually see the difference in quality between the 240 and the 120 and the 60. You can see like the slight jagginess and the sharpness is just not there. So I mean, I suppose it's better on the phone, really. If you're just going to watch your video on the phone, I guess it's okay. But the main reason I'm probably not going to use the 240 frames per second ever again is because I've been having so much problem with it. When I import it into my PC, for some reason I keep getting these weird frame rates. Like instead of 240, I'm getting 178.92 or something like that, which offers a huge problem. As you can probably see in these samples that are 240, the footage is not smooth at all, because when it's 178.92 or whatever, if you try to spread those frames out on a 24 frame timeline or 25 frame timeline or 30 or whatever, it's not going to be able to spread it out evenly throughout the frames. So if you divide by 2, that's going to be like some weird frames left over or whatever. So when I slow it down, it's going to be like, there's going to be frame skipping and jerkiness and things like that, which is just horrible, because not only the footage already pretty low quality, it's also not smooth either. So I'm not sure what's the point of using it. Now with the 120 frames per second, when I import into Windows, it just shows as 120 frames per second clip. Then I just slow it down by a fifth or whatever, and then it will play smoothly. There is actually a way around to fix the 240 frames per second playing, to make it play smoothly on a PC. You can actually just import the video into iMovie on the iPhone. So basically you have to render it into a slow motion, like a pre-baked slow motion on the iPhone first before importing it onto your PC. So I would need to import each clip into iMovie, then render it out at the speed that you want. So you slow it down in iMovie by like 8 times and then you render it out. Still, there's a problem with that, because with the annoying iPhone, right? When you record slow motion, you know how it does it. When you play it, you see the clip plays normal speed for like a few seconds, then you slow down, right? And then becomes slow motion, and then towards the end it will speed back up again. Now every time you import it into iMovie, that would be built in. So you have to go to the beginning of the clip and delete the part that's like normal speed. So at the beginning it will play normal speed, then it will slow down to a slow motion clip, right? So you have to delete the beginning of the clip or at least go and change it so that instead of playing normally at the beginning, it's just slow motion from the beginning. And then you have to go to the end of the clip and change the end bit so that it plays as a slow motion as well. Then you have to render it out. Then you have to import it to Windows. So as you can imagine, if you have just 20 clips, it's gonna take you like an hour just to do all that, which is so annoying. And not only that, I've been searching for a way to just set it. Maybe you can set, a default so that the entire video is already slow motion without having to slow down and speed up. And apparently, Apple being Apple, that is not available. So what the hell? I don't understand. If people record slow motion, surely a lot of people would just want it to play as a slow motion throughout the entire clip. But no, we just have to have this. It's just so annoying. At least we should be able to set it to default, that the entire clip plays as a slow motion instead of. I'm gonna give up. Nothing's gonna change with Apple. Anyways, I think I went off on a bit of a rant there, but let's get back to talking about the slow motion footage. I complained quite a lot about the 240, but the 120, now that greatly surprised me. I have the Sony Alpha 7S Mark II, which can also do the Full HD 120, and I've got to say, the quality you get from the iPhone is actually very, very similar, almost the same as the Sony, which is amazing. The Sony is like a full frame camera, although of course when you want to record 120, it has to crop in by half, so it's like about a micro four thirds sensor, but still the iPhone doesn't have to crop at all when you record slow motion 120. So again, that's even another advantage which a lot of people might like. You don't have to crop in when you're recording slow motion. And wow, the image you get with this is you can actually record like wide angle detailed scenes, although you can obviously going to start to see, because those scenes are quite taxing on the bit rate, you're gonna see like some degradation of the more compression, more motion artifacts, but still it's still very usable. And when you try to help the image a little bit, you can get some very beautiful images. So when I say try to help the image, what I mean is try not to film scenes that are too taxing on the bitrate. And this is true not just for the iPhone or any phone, even for DSLR, mirrorless or full frame video camera recorder even. Most of it within our price range are going to be using a codec that has limited bitrate. So there's only a certain amount of data that can be spread around to record all the details within a scene. So as you try to film scenes with more and more detail, the quality of the image will start to degrade a little bit, and more as the amount of detail goes up. So the worst case scenario for pretty much any camera, not just the iPhone, is when, let's say, you want to film a wide angle shot of a forest, with all the little leaves flowing within the wind, swaying around. There's just so much detail to record. And if you try to record those kind of scene in wide angle, let's say at f9, where every single thing is supposed to be sharp and in focus, the image is going to struggle quite a bit. That's why so many of the spectacular shots you see will comprise of some sort of model or subject standing in the foreground in front of some beautiful landscape or beautiful scenery as a background, and it's all kind of blurred out as bokeh. So obviously they might use an f2, f2.8 or f4 or whatever to focus on the subject, and the background will be all nice and creamy and out of focus, and the shot will look so spectacular. Whereas if you go and film the same scene where you don't have a model or a subject, you just film where all the landscape is in focus, the shot just doesn't look quite as good. So some of the shots you might be wondering, since you might be using the same camera, some of these shots you see, you're like wondering, why is my shot not as spectacular? It doesn't look as good. Why there's lots of compression? It doesn't look as creamy and nice and smooth. Well, the shot with the subject in the foreground, with the background being blurred out, the blurred background is actually going to take much less bit rate to record than if the background was all in focus and you had to record all those little details. When the background is blurred out and is in like bokeh, it's just a nice creamy pattern of color, so it's not going to be as taxing on the bit rate itself. So having said all that, you can definitely get some very spectacular and beautiful shots out of the 120 frames per second slow motion on the iPhone 12 for sure. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the same technique can be used for the 4K 60 as well to get an even more beautiful shot where you just try to film scenes that are not so taxing on the bitrate of the recording modes. In conclusion, well, in my own opinion and my own expectations, the 4K 60 and the 120 is definitely better than I was expecting, which is quite surprising. And for the 240, I never expected it to be usable anyway, or very usable, because I mean, if it was beautiful and usable, that would be ridiculous, because even the Sony Alpha 7 III, if you try to record 240, the picture is going to be, the quality is pretty bad. And you can look up samples online on YouTube. So if suddenly the iPhone record better 240 than like the latest DSLR and camera, that would just be a bit ridiculous. And I never expected it to be like really usable anyway. Okay, well, I hope that was somewhat useful to anyone wondering what kind of slow motion footage they can expect to get out of the iPhone 12. I knew I was before buying the phone, so I hope this was somewhat useful. And also, plus I always have anxiety when I'm offered a lot of options of recording modes, because I'm always like paranoid about trying to use the best recording mode possible for any situation. I'm always wondering, should I just record 60p? Would I suffer any quality loss from 24p, and if so, how much? Or should I just use 120, or 120, would that be usable? Should I just go 240? And I'm always like have this anxiety about me until I try to test it out, and I know, and once I know, I kind of, okay, I can relax now. I can just use 4K 60 and I know that'll be great quality. And if I really need slow motion, very very slow motion, then I'll use 120, and 240 is probably not that usable, and 4K 24 only if I'm filming very try to go for that cinema look. Well, anyway, I think this clip has gone way longer than expected, or should at this point, so I'll just say goodbye here. Bye.